I'm Larry O'Connor, alongside Brian Wilson.
Joining us on the line now from the Washington Examiner is Susan Ferrechio, chief congressional correspondent, one of the best reporters on Capitol Hill. Susan, good to have you with us this morning.
Good morning, guys.
Listen, I want to start out by talking about this pending lawsuit. The Speaker of the House has made it very clear that he's going to file a lawsuit against the President of the United States. You know, a lot of people have not been paying much attention to this, but I think this is a story of epic political proportions. When the Speaker of the House files a lawsuit against the President of the United States and says, look, you know, we think you're exceeding your presidential authority. So where are we on this lawsuit? When will it be filed? And what's being said about it on Capitol Hill?
It's so interesting. It reminds me of like two neighbors that just didn't get along for years and years, and it finally culminates into one suing the other. I mean, this is just classic for me, just having covered Congress and Obama for the past 6 years. The dynamic here has evolved into this I mean, what was really interesting about President Obama, comparing him to President Clinton, was he really had no interest in reaching out or working with Congress. And I think even though we had a Republican Congress, that if he had chosen to reach out and work with them, that we wouldn't really be seeing this happen right now, that this whole lawsuit would, you know, they'd be talking about it in the White House. It's amazing to me it's evolved into this, but I think it's two things. It's the partisanship, for sure. That's gotten worse and worse over the years. We've seen it. But it's also President Obama's real lack of interest in working with Congress. So now you have Boehner threatening to sue, and I think that this is going to happen. I think it's going to, you know, the base wants this. The Republican base wants to stop the president from taking these executive actions. It's really angered the Republicans. It's one thing after another. It's the health care law, the EPA with the coal regulations and pollution regulations, now the border. I mean, look what's happening on the border, which Republicans think was brought along by the Deferred Action Program, which was another executive move by the president. That said, if you come here as a child illegally, we'll find a way for you to be legal here for a couple years and maybe even longer. And that's invited people to pour over the border at this point. So this lawsuit is going to be really interesting, and I don't think it's going to fade out of interest just because of what's going on the border right now.
And since you brought up the border issue, Susan Ferrechio, we're told now that the president, in asking for $2 billion of aid to help deal with this crisis, he's now not going to apply that money to fast-track these kids through deportation processes and send them back.
Interesting development. This happened last night. See, the rule is that under law, if you're from the children can't be deported to a non-contiguous state. In other words, if they're not from Mexico and they're from Honduras or El Salvador, we can't deport them because this was a law that was put in place during President Bush in order to avoid sex trafficking. That was the purpose of the law. Well, now it's being used to keep these kids here. Now, the president was going to ask for authority from Congress to change that back so that he'd be able to more easily send these kids back home. Well, now he's under pressure from immigration groups, and it sounds like he doesn't want to do that now. He's backed off. However, he is asking for $2 billion from Congress in a supplemental budget in order to help deal with the border crisis. I'm told by my Republican sources that they are likely going to insist on putting that language back in that the president didn't want to ask for, the one that would give executive authority to send the children back home and not keep them here. That's the whole issue. Once they get here from Honduras and El Salvador, it's really hard for us to deport them. It's almost impossible under the law. If they change the law back, it will be much easier. And if we started sending them back, people will be less likely to be motivated to come over the border right now. Right now they think, hey, once I'm in, I'm in. If they see it's not working, people are being sent home. The Republicans are going to insist on that, I believe, when the supplemental budget comes to Congress this week.
So I just want to reiterate that means we're going to have a showdown between House Republicans and Senate Democrats over this funding, because one must assume that the Democrats are reticent to fast-track this deportation process.
Really interesting. I was talking to some Republicans last night, and you guys, I'm wondering if this. I would say it's possible they will leave for the August break and not pass any supplemental budget, because it's like you said, they're going to insist on some language in there, and the Democrats aren't going to like it. And it, like you said, it could be a showdown. And when that happens, gridlock ensues, as we all know all too well. And it's possible they'll leave without having, because Republicans actually think the president doesn't need this money, that there's a lot he can do under the law that he's choosing not to do.
Yeah, he can just use his pen and his phone. He caused the problem by executive action. Why can't he solve it with executive
As Larry
action?
pointed out earlier this morning, he has ignored many immigration laws, but he chooses to not ignore this one.
Yeah, hallelujah. We finally found the law the president won't break.
Well, interestingly, you guys, I was hearing from people who are on the border who were saying, for instance, if a family of 4 comes over the border together, a mother and father and 2 children, they will be sent back. But if they split up, if the mom and one child comes over one day and the dad and another child comes over another day, they're allowed to stay. So the rules are being altered to allow more people to stay in the country. And it's really interesting. And I think that's why Republicans are thinking, why is the president not just enforcing, why are these deportation laws being changed to allow more people to stay here all of a sudden? And you're right. I think that's what's going to provoke a showdown for sure.
Well, and a showdown seems likely, and this is such a hot-button issue. Do you see that? Is it possible that nothing will happen, that the gridlock will continue with no resolution?
Absolutely, because the Republicans feel the president is just continually overstepping his authority, and that's to get back to the lawsuit. And I think that because of that, they're not really willing to work with him. There's no goodwill. There's no trust. Look at it this way. Why would Republicans want to give $2 billion to the president? If he's only going to invite more people over the border, I think they feel like he's not enforcing the law. What I'm hearing from Republicans is the point here is he needs to enforce the law. And so I think there needs to be some cooperation. I was hearing from Chairman Bob Goodlatte of the Judiciary Committee was telling me that he thinks the solution might be this: spend some money on helping Mexico enforce its southern border. Because once people cross into Mexico, they don't want people crossing into Mexico and cutting through and coming to the United States. But they're having a hard time keeping them out. So if we can stop them from getting in Mexico, they're not going to come here. And we won't run into the problem with not being able to deport kids from non-contiguous countries. So it's really interesting how, there are plans being discussed that would help resolve this problem, but I don't hear the president talking about that. If he worked a little harder with the Mexican government and other Central American governments, that we could stop this from happening. But he's not doing that, and you have to ask why. Why is that?
Susan Ferrechio is our guest, chief congressional correspondent for the Washington Examiner. We actually only have about 30 seconds, but I wanted to touch base with you since Congress is back in town. Any word on Trey Gowdy's Benghazi Select Committee or on the IRS investigations this week?
Well, both are definitely heating up. Benghazi, there are no hearings yet scheduled on Benghazi, but the IRS issue is going to come to a head this week. We have 2 really interesting court cases involving the IRS. So we're looking at it outside judges actually taking a look at this. The most interesting one involving True the Vote. They would like an outside group to be able to determine whether the IRS truly cannot recover those 2 years' worth of missing emails.
Okay.
Depending on what a judge rules, we could have an outside force here other than the IRS trying to figure out how to get these emails back. And that, to me, is a really interesting prospect.
We will keep an eye on that, as we know you will, for the Washington Examiner, Susan Ferrechio.
Always a pleasure. Thank you, Susan.
Thanks, guys.